Can you explain why a movie does not make business sense?
It's such an interesting question and an interesting model when you talk about the movie industry and the film industry. And it it's the reason it's interesting is because Hollywood's always existed in this bubble because it was always so difficult to be able to create entertainment, and the technology wasn't democratized, so not a lot of people could make entertainment. And so whenever entertainment was made, especially a film, whenever a film was made, it was a very special, rare thing, and a lot of that defied the rules of economics in the rest of the world. Now it seems that in a commoditized market, and there's so much content, that when you look at just the business of filmmaking, it doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. And if you go out and talk to a lot of investors, and the investors a lot of times will tell you, most times they'll tell you that the economics of the industry just doesn't make sense for them, where you put a lot of money in, especially say like a independent film venture. You put a lot of money in up front. You don't see any return for a long time. There's no sort of incubation model that you see out of Silicon Valley or even just a startup business. It's a big, crazy roll of the dice. You put a lot of money in, and you just hope and pray that a bunch of people show up on the same weekend, and if they show up on the first 2 weekends at least, maybe you get your money back. But if they don't, then you lose it all. And it's just a high risk. It's a high risk venture, especially in a commoditized market where there's this hyper competition. And so if you look at even other aspects, I mean, you think of other aspects of the way normal business is done. Typically, the cost of production will drive the retail cost of a product, for example. And so if you can make a Toyota for $10,000, then you can, of hard cost manufacturing, you could sell it for, I don't know, $22,000, and there you have a margin in there to make your money. But if it costs $90,000 to make a Maserati, then you have to sell it for $200,000 in order to have your margin. You can't sell it for $20,000 or else you're going to lose money. And that just makes sense, right? Of course, that's the way the world works. But when in filmmaking, I could make a $5,000 Paranormal Activity, and you could make a $300 million Avengers movie, and someone still pays the same $12 at the movie theater for the product. And that makes sense to us in the Hollywood bubble, but for the rest of the world, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so now you're starting to see a lot of conversation around the variable pricing, and maybe blockbusters should be $50 movie tickets, and Paranormal Activity or indie films should be $2 tickets, and maybe we should scale ticket prices to the cost of production, trying to pull it more in line with the way normal business works. And so really, when it just comes down to it, especially if you don't have any pre-awareness of the market, the venture to most people is just very, very risky. Especially when you add in the cost of P&A and how much you have to saturate the market with marketing just to get people there. It takes the break even in a really crazy way. I think Steven Soderbergh said a couple years ago that he predicted the death of the independent film market within 5 to 10 years, because the cost of P&A was going through the roof at this tremendous rate. So he said, when 15 years ago, you would spend $3 million to make an independent film, and then you would put an equal amount in for P&A with the distributor would. You put an equal amount in for the P&A, and then ultimately you work out your break even from that, right? So usually if you put $3 million production, $3 million P&A, what happens is you have to recoup 50 cents on the dollar for the P&A. And so you actually have to make $6 million to make back the $3 million of the P&A, because you split it, the distributor splits it with the exhibitors, right? So that's how it would work out. But now Steven Soderbergh says, especially with independent films, everything's so competitive and they're so oversaturated, and the market is so commoditized, that he says, if you want to be a blip on the radar, you have to spend at least $35 million of domestic P&A, $35 million of international P&A just so people know that you're out there because there's so much stuff hitting the market all the time. So let's take a $5 million movie, for example. If you make a movie for $5 million and then you spend $35 million domestic P&A, $35 million of international P&A, that's $70 million of P&A, which means you have to make $140 million to pay back, to recoup that, right? Because you have to split every dollar with the exhibitor and you recoup 50 cents on the dollar. So you have to make $140 million plus the $5 million production budget, which means it's a $145 million break even on a $5 million movie. Why does that matter? This is why it matters. Independent filmmakers require and rely on going to investors and saying, will you give me your money so that I can make my movie? And so just imagine the conversation of going to an investor and saying, I need you to give me $5 million of your money so I can make my movie. And all we need to do is make $145 million at the box office and you get all your money, you get all your money back. Does that make sense at all? It really doesn't. It doesn't to most people. Now, some people have they have an appetite for risk and they, and they want their granddaughter to be able to star in a movie, and so they don't care to fund it, and they do it for other reasons, vanity projects, things like that. But more and more investors now today think that just doesn't make sense. That's why studios love to do $100 million movies. This is where we've seen the death of the $20 million film, I think, is because think about like a $100 million movie, put a $100 million production budget with $100 million domestic P&A, $100 million of international P&A. That's $200 million of P&A. You recoup that 50 cents on the dollar, which means you have to make $400 million back, plus the $100 million production budget. That's a $500 million break even on a $100 million movie. So how many $100 million movies make $500 million as opposed to a $20 million movie making $250 million, right? Now all of a sudden the $100 million movie makes maybe more economic sense than the $20 million movie because the P&A is thrown all out of whack, right? So as filmmakers, we look at films through the lens of the art and the films of through the lens of the story and what we want to achieve and what we want to say culturally, but we fail to put ourselves in the seat of the investor. And this is something that I've learned. I'm not a naturally inclined business person. Some people are super entrepreneurial and they get their MBA and things like that. But I'm not a natural business person. But the more I was talking with investors, the more they would and the more they would tell me no. I would say, why doesn't it make sense to you? And they would explain why this doesn't make sense. And when I look at it from the investor's point of view, then I'm like, wow, yeah, that is kind of crazy. And that's why we're seeing independent film investment dry up more and more, because just the economics of the business model just doesn't compute with the people that have to fund the whole thing. And so you have to understand that they're coming from it. Usually, by and large, investors, independent film investors, aren't filmmakers. They're business people, right? They've made their money in other sectors, right? So they're looking at everything through a completely different frame than the filmmaker, by and large. And I think the more filmmakers can get in tune with the economics surrounding a film and figure out how to reorient the economics of the venture to match the economics of a consumer brand venture or a regular, or like a Silicon Valley startup, figure out how do we start to have the film venture look like one of those other things. And I think if we do that, then we're going to see maybe an uptick in the amount of investment that now goes into independent films, which would be great for everybody, right? But it's just going to take a paradigm shift. Movies aren't as special as they used to be because there's so many of them. And so we can't just rely on movies being as magical in the eyes of investors before. We can't dazzle them with a movie, I don't think, as much. Now we have to make sense to them, and we have to be empathetic to the seat that they sit in.
Is the film industry the only industry where, to graph out what you talked about and really go down line by line, it doesn't make business sense? Or are there other industries where it's very similar?
Well, I think when you look at what you typically look for is the difference between a commoditized business and a non-commoditized business. And these are big $10 words, but the difference is, commoditization is where is a term where you're in a market where you're no longer unique. And because there's so much competition, there's hyper competition and oversaturation that has flooded the market. Most businesses operate in commoditized markets, but businesses that operate outside of commoditized markets, by and large, can set their own rules, and they can defy those odds because what they're doing is so special and so unique. They kind of get a pass because they're creating something that hardly anybody else is creating, until other people start duplicating that and they become commoditized as well. And there was a time when the smartphone was not commoditized. And so all of a sudden, Apple and Steve Jobs, they could sort of set the rules of the game, of the economics of the smartphone. And it was up to them, not the market forces. But now I think smartphones have become commoditized in such a way that it's a different market than it was 10, 15 years ago, or 12 years ago, however long smartphones have been out, right? So I think when you're looking for the businesses that operate outside of a normal paradigm, you're looking for the businesses that are just super unique, that don't have a lot of competition. And when you don't have a lot of competition, I'm from Kentucky, and they call that being in the catbird seat. You're in an advantageous situation. And entertainment used to be that. And filmmaking used to be that because it was always too hard, too expensive, too difficult to be able to make a movie. We didn't have access to the camera technology and to the post-production technology. We didn't have access, we had to shoot on film, and film's super expensive. We didn't have the digital technology, and we definitely didn't have distribution. I mean, the biggest shift, I think, for filmmakers, since the invention of the talkie is the internet being a distribution mechanism. And because now the ability to create and the ability to distribute has been democratized to the filmmaker. But always before, people didn't have the technology to create, and even if you figured out how to create, you didn't know what to do with it because you couldn't distribute. And so that was tough. And so the only people that could create movies were 5 or 6 companies in the entire world that had the technology and had the infrastructure for distribution that could do that. So anytime a movie would hit, it would be super special. And it would be an event, and it would be because we just didn't have a lot of them coming out. I mean, think about. I remember when I was a kid, E.T. was in the movie theater for over a year, I believe. It was around a year, right? Just in the theater, the theatrical run. Now, Star Wars was in there, I think, 44 weeks, the original Star Wars movie. You look at something like even Back to the Future had like a 35-week run in movie theaters. Now you look at Avengers Endgame, which before the re-release of Avatar was objectively the most successful film of all time, Avengers Endgame. That was in movie theaters for 3 months? And then it was pushed out. There's too much stuff being pushed into the system, right? There's too much stuff in the pipeline. I mean, you talk to showrunners, they say 15 years ago, there were 7 places that you could sell a 1-hour drama. Now there's 75 places you can sell a 1-hour drama, right? Everybody's making stuff because the technology's become democratized. And so the entertainment industry has shifted from a non-commoditized, very special, magical, like dazzling, glittery thing into the same bucket as smartphones and potato chips and coffee shops and everything else that is commoditized, which is now forcing filmmakers and executives and studios and everybody that makes this stuff. Now we have to relearn and what are the rules of the game? What are the economics of the game? How do we shift this to better compete in a commoditized market? I'm completely convinced that the shift into a commoditized market is, I think, for fans, it's the best thing that's ever happened, because we got as much content as we got more content than we could ever consume. More movies we could ever watch, more TV shows that we could ever watch, more books we could ever read, more games we could ever play, more songs we could ever listen to. We can't watch everything on YouTube. We can't, like, there's more TikTok videos than any one person could ever consume ever, which is great for fans. But the commoditized market, I think, is the single biggest obstacle facing filmmakers today. The obstacle of access and creation has been solved, right? Because we got cameras. We have if you've seen the new iPhone, the iPhone 13 that they announced, like the camera technology in that is absolutely amazing, right? And even the iPhone 12, absolutely amazing what you can do with the camera technology with that, right? But even then, beyond just the phones, I mean, you can go get a Red camera, a Red Epic for a few $1,000s, and you can rent a lens, for several $100s over the weekend, and you're able to do that. You didn't used to be able to do that. Now you can. And so that has been solved. Access and creation has been solved, I think, for filmmakers. Distribution has been solved for filmmakers. We know now how to get our stuff to audiences. We know how to get it in front of people. We know how to build community. We go direct to consumer in about 35 different platforms, right? In addition to the other traditional platforms of selling to the studios. But even if you want to go direct to consumer, we have the ability to do that. The fact that I can shoot a video right now and hit a few buttons and upload it to YouTube, and instantly it's in 6 billion people's pockets is insane and crazy and awesome and exciting. So access has been solved, distribution has been solved, but now we've traded those problems in for a new problem, which is, how do we survive in a commoditized market? How do we outpunch 3 million other things that are all competing against each other? Somebody said to me recently, they said, making a movie today is like being a needle in a haystack, because you just release it and there's so much other stuff. I don't actually think it's being a needle in a haystack. I think releasing a movie in today's market is like being a needle in a needle stack. If you're in a needle in a haystack, at least you're unique. But now, when you release your horror movie into the market, that's awesome. That's such an amazing achievement, right? But 1,000 other people are releasing their horror movie at the same time, and you're no longer unique. And now you have all this crazy competition, and now you have to figure out how to outpunch your way, outpunch your way from the glut of horror movies, but also all the other movies and all the other television shows and all the other books. And then don't even get me started about the TikTok videos and Fortnite and things like that pull everybody's competition, or it pulls everybody's eyeballs, right? And which would create this hyper competition between all platforms, right? So it's that obstacle of a commoditized market that I think needs to be the focus of filmmakers as we go out of 2021 into 2022 and beyond. We need to figure out, again, obviously you need to make a good movie and you need to tell a great story. You need to have rich characters, all the craft stuff still applies. I'm not talking about that. But now we have to shift the paradigm of our minds and say, what kind of model and business model and IP model can I launch that is not going to survive 1997 Paramount Pictures Hollywood? Because 1997 was great, but it was a long time ago, and we don't live in that market anymore. Today's market is a commoditized market, and I need my plan and my model and my approach to survive that. And that's a completely different conversation.
What is the business model for filmmakers today?
It's a complicated question, because the question could be, what should be the business model for filmmakers today, but what is the model for filmmakers today? I think still sits wholly in that traditional model of, I got to go to the studio and I got to option my script and go through the development process and and go through that whole thing. There's the whole traditional side of the business that's still moving along, but now on the outside of the studio system, then you're looking at a different business model that is more IP focused. And I think if you really study the market and understand the way the market works, it's about how do you launch and grow IP. And this is not a new concept, because we've known for decades that everything that we see on TV is always based on a book. And even the stuff that we know is the most original, we think is the most original stuff we've ever considered, and we love the originality of this limited series or this interesting film. 98% of the time, you trace it back and it's based on a book. And the reason it's based on a book isn't because Hollywood's in love with books. It's because they love the pre-awareness that the books bring. They love the community that's already built for the book, and it skews the risk analysis into the favor of the filmmaker when they say, hey, let's take this book and let's make it a movie. It's just a lower risk investment. And so IP creation and establishing IP in the market has always been a thing, but now with the proliferation of other platforms and the democratization of other platforms, where normal people can have access to these other platforms, such as podcast and Webtoon and short stories on Wattpad, comic books, things like that. Now the business model for creators is how to take their IP and attack the market in whatever platform they can, so that they could establish a market presence, grow the community of that around that IP, actually get fans. And then once they have fans, then maybe down the road, they go and shop this thing for film and television. Because when you do that, you can actually have a conversation because you have something established in the market and you have fans and you've established pre-awareness. And I think pre-awareness is vital in today's market because of the high risk economics of filmmaking. Because of the P&A budgets, because the production budgets are just increasing so much. I mean, you look at the Lord of the Rings series on Amazon. They spent $250 million just for the rights, and then they spent $450 million in production for one season of TV. And so they're spending $750 million on a season of television. And so they're not going to do that with something that hasn't been established in the market. The only reason they're comfortable with spending $750 million is because Lord of the Rings is an established IP in the market, and there's a legion of Tolkien fans, and they've tested the Hobbit movies and Lord of the Rings movies, and it's been around for a zillion years, and all of a sudden it skews the risk analysis into the favor of the studio. They said, I think we can do it. I mean, you look at the Foundation series that's coming out on Apple, that Apple's releasing. And that was a series of books that's been around forever. And a lot of people maybe won't know that and think, oh, this is just original filmmaking. No, it's established IP in the market. But used to, you could only, the only way you could do that is through a book. But now, like I said, you can do that in a variety of different ways. And so one of the most optioned things in Hollywood right now are podcasts. Podcasts are wildly popular as far as being optioned. And you look at what Amazon did with Homecoming, not Beyonce Homecoming, but the other Homecoming with Julia Roberts, the drama series, and that was a podcast. You look at something like Night Vale, that was a podcast. You look at what HBO Max, they greenlit the Calm app TV show. I don't know if you're familiar with the Calm app. The Calm app's been a top 10 app in the App Store for the last 10 years. A meditation app. It's just a meditation app that promotes mental health and makes you calm and helps you meditate. And HBO Max just greenlit a TV show based on the app, which makes no sense other than there's a brand there and there's a community there and there's pre-awareness in the market. They'll hire a writer and they'll hire producers and they'll hire talent that'll make it work. But what they were looking for is there the pre-awareness in the market? And you see something with Angry Birds. Angry Birds launched into the market not as the animated films, launched into the market as a mobile game. And so I think that is the new business model for creators, is how do I not wait for Netflix or Amazon or Universal Pictures or Disney to give me permission to make my dreams come true. I don't want to wait for Netflix to give me permission to tell the story that's in my heart. You'll be waiting forever, right? And you'll be deceived by the fact that there are some people that Netflix does come and make their dreams come true, and they give them the big giant check. But for every one person that's waiting for that it actually works for, there's 100,000 people, 100,000 filmmakers that never get that break. And it's not because they're less talented. It's just because it's a hard industry and it's competitive. And there's a lot of super talented people out there, and it's tough to be able, and the line around Netflix is, 10 blocks long, figuratively speaking, with people that want to get in Netflix, right? So people are waiting for these studios to give them permission to follow their heart and tell their story, when I say that's cool, but don't wait. Or at least while you're waiting, attack the market. While you're waiting, launch your IP in the 10 or 15 or 20 ways that we have at your fingertips at all time that you can do for very little or zero money. A podcast. You can take your iPhone and you can download Anchor. And Anchor is a free app on the App Store that will allow you to hold up the phone to your ear, and it records your podcast into the phone. And then and you can put bumper music and you can edit it, and then it distributes it into the Apple Podcast Store, and it puts it on Spotify, all completely for free. And then you can use the distribution platforms and social media and things like that to get it in front of people, start building your audience. And you can actually tell the story that you want to tell while you're waiting on Netflix. But the trick is then, if you actually grow the community of people that love your podcast, love your story, and are engaging with your brand, you've increased your chances from hearing from Netflix because you've actually created pre-awareness of the market, right? And you accelerate. I mean, there was an IP that I had. We sold to Fox. It languished in development. Went into turnaround. We got it back, and we had played that game for 7 years, trying to shop it, finally got it shopped, went into turnaround, got it back, 7 years. And I thought, what would have happened if we would have been running a podcast the entire time? What would have happened if we would have had comic books in the market and released self-published novels into the market? We wouldn't, when it goes in the turnaround, we wouldn't be at zero again. We would have had fans, and we would have had a brand, and we would have had IP. The film and television wouldn't have worked the way we wanted it to work, and then we'd have to kind of reorganize that. But at least we would have done some other things and attack the market in a way, and not just wait for a giant studio to give me a giant Ed McMahon check and say, I give you permission to tell the story that you've always wanted to tell. And it's so I'm very, very bullish on encouraging filmmakers, don't wait. Launch. Use all the stuff that we have, all the tools in the toolbox to launch the IP. If you know people that can produce music, work with them to maybe tell a story through a song and launch that. If you know how to write a short story, launch that. If you know how to do a podcast, do it that way. Do a webtoon. Do something. And it helps you not be frustrated as you wait to hear back from an agent and sending out query letters and the whole game that we all know, which is, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying, okay, let's do that. But while we do that, let's do some other things. So you're not just sitting around waiting to hear back from people. You're actually doing something, right? Which keeps you happy as a storyteller to be able to tell your stories. I mean, personally, I found myself years ago as a writer, the things that I wrote most were pitch decks. I found myself writing more pitch decks than I did scripts. And that was disconcerting to me, right? Because that's sort of what you kind of fall into in Hollywood, is this crazy game of just trying to like hustle something. And you're doing a lot less creating and just a lot more pitching, right? And so I think there's an artistic and a soulful benefit to launching IP in the market. It satisfies you as you wait for the big guys to come and make your dreams come true. But then there's also a legal benefit to it. And so, I consider myself a recovering lawyer. I started my career as a lawyer and almost completely recovered as a lawyer. But from a legal perspective, if you can establish an IP in the market, there's a lot greater chance of you getting a better deal on the back end if and when the studio comes and wants to participate into a feature film. If you just write a spec script, and you go and like filmmakers do and like writers do, and you go sell that spec script, and it's not based on any pre-existing IP, it's just an original idea, and you settle on spec. Say you get on the blacklist, and they snatch it off the blacklist, and they give you a deal. That's awesome. It's by and large a wholesale acquisition. We're taking the whole bucket of rights, and we'll give you a check. That's a high five handoff that, you go off and, we'll take this and we'll go and make this movie. But they have all the rights to every platform ever created, and Here Forever 2 will be created until the end of time. There's all those big lawyerly clauses in there. They own everything, right? They take the whole deal. Theoretically, they give you a check to make you feel better about that, right? Which sometimes that makes you feel better, other times it doesn't. But if you say publish a book, self-publish a book, and that book sells, and you're able to then get that to be turned into a movie, the deal that is then done is a different deal. It's then you have what's called a split rights deal, where they come and license the right to adapt the book into a movie, right? So they take the film and television rights, right? But it's a license deal for the film and television rights, and you maintain your other IP rights. Video game, comic books, merchant, things like other things that you want to create, right? And which is much better in success of the movie, right? Or the TV show or whatever they do, then all these other rights become more valuable, and you've retained them simply because you were able to establish the IP in the market. And you didn't go to the studios first, right? So even if you don't want to talk about the sort of the creative benefits of attacking the market and being aggressive with the IP and not waiting, right, and being passive, as your fake lawyer, that I would give you this legal advice: never just sell a spec script to a studio. It's crazy. Just self-publish it as a book first. Now, 10 years ago, before you could really self-publish, or there wasn't really podcast and there weren't really these other things, then what are you supposed to do? The only thing you could do is just sell it directly to a studio. There's not a lot of other options, right? Now there are so many options. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to be able to go to them first. You're misappropriating and losing sight of the broader opportunity of your IP. So I think the new business model for creators is a business model to attack the market with IP. Attack the market with IP. And when you generate the pre-awareness of the community, it's going to create residual benefits that are not only going to make you more attractive to the studios, but it's actually going to help you retain and control more of the IP moving forward.
And from what I understand about this new Netflix series, Made, with Margaret Qualley, it started as an article. Mm-hmm. A woman who was in a homeless shelter with her child. She was cleaning houses, and she kind of wrote this thing about, hey, what people don't know about what I know about you from cleaning your house.
Sure.
And that took off, and then she did this book,
yeah.
and now we have this show coming up. And
sure.
I'm looking forward to seeing it. And again, that was someone that was always wanted to be a writer, had a lot of tragic things happen, and decided to hunker down and sort of make the best of it. And look at now it's
sure.
That's a rags to riches story right there.
And if she would have just written that as a spec script, and then just started shopping that around, I think we wouldn't be having this conversation today, because it would be languishing in the crazy game that is the spec world of Hollywood. Right? She was able to take this and then launch it in a different way. Let's write the article. Let's do it. Let's launch it in a different form. Let's then publish the book. Let's do it as a blog. Let's do something else, right? And then we grow awareness, we grow the pre-awareness, we've actually established the IP in the market, and then guess what? Especially when it becomes popular, then the studios want to get involved. And that deal, and I'm not privy to the specifics of the deal, but I would guarantee that deal that was made for that particular IP is a better deal than she would have got if she would have written the spec script and tried to sell that spec script first. I don't think she would have sold the spec script to begin with, but in the event that she would have, it would have been a worse deal than what she got now, simply because she was able to establish it in the market, right? But see, this is the interesting thing. It's a paradigm shift with filmmakers. Typically, filmmakers and screenwriters, and listen, I include myself in this umbrella. So we want to focus on filmmaking and screenwriting, and we feel like if I just write my 5 pages a day, everything's going to work. And I don't want to learn how to do a podcast. Like, that's not me. I don't want to learn how to make a website. I don't want to write short stories. I'm a screenwriter, right? And I wish that person would have been born in 1978 and then, was able to be able to operate in, late 80s, 90s Hollywood because it was just as a different market, and you could kind of, specialize like that. But it's a different market, and there's this hesitancy, for lack of a better word, if I say that euphemistically, there's this hesitancy to broaden your scope of creative to be able to launch an IP in the market. You feel like you're doing something that's less than screenwriting. You're lowering yourself to do a short story. You're lowering yourself to do a podcast. There's this artistic judgment. And you feel like and maybe you just judge yourself of like, man, that this means that if I was good enough, I'd be able to sell this thing, right? And you judge yourself for it, and you shouldn't judge yourself for that. There's too much stuff out there, and it's way too competitive. And I think if creators and filmmakers and screenwriters, if they had the mind of an entrepreneur who's launching a consumer brand, you're gonna approach this whole thing differently. Because you talk to any entrepreneur that says, I'm gonna start a pizza shop, right? And I'm gonna open the pizza shop, and it's gonna be great because I have this family recipe of pizza I've been working on. Like, they are forced to learn 100 new skills in order to launch that pizza shop, right? You never hear somebody say, I want to launch my pizza shop with my family recipe of pizza, and I'm only going to focus on making the pizza. I'm not going to learn how to do payroll. I'm not going to learn how to hire front of house, back house. I'm not going to learn how to order. I'm not going to learn about management. I'm not going to learn how to do the register. I'm not going to learn about anything else other than pizza. And that's it. I'm just going to focus on my pizza. And as long as I make good pizza, everything will fall into place. Odds are that pizza shop will never open, right? Because of course, entrepreneurs know, I want to do a pizza shop. I know how to make a good pizza. Okay, I still have to learn how to run the register, and I still have to learn how to market the right way, and I still have to learn how to, how to manage my staff, and I still have to learn how to order all the food from the wholesalers and things like that. You're forced into figuring out 5 or 6 new things that you've never figured out before, and that's just part of being an entrepreneur. And every entrepreneur will tell you that. Like, you're forced to learn 100 new things. What are those 10 new things that we need to learn as screenwriters and filmmakers? What are the 20 new things that we can learn as creators that can help us launch the IP? And here's the good part. Here's the punchline that I think is the greatest punchline of all time. It's all there on the internet for free. YouTube is the greatest educational platform in the history of mankind. If I want to figure out how to change a 1987 Volvo station wagon's carburetor, there's probably a YouTube video that's going to walk me through it. We can go to YouTube, go to Google, and say, how do I create a podcast? And there's 17 articles instantly, or 17 videos that pop up. You can go to LinkedIn Learning or you can go to whatever, like a resource that you want to use, And you can take the 7 to 10 to 27 hours to figure it out. And not only that, you can connect with people that know how to do it. I had a buddy who he won the Nichols Fellowship as a screenwriter, right? Which is a big deal. Nichols is a very competitive screenwriting competition. He won the Nichols Fellowship. He pitched a movie to Paramount Pictures as a result of winning the Nichols Fellowship. He pitched the script to Paramount. Paramount said it was too risky because it wasn't established in the marketplace. And they said, we want you to go and create a comic book and launch it as a comic book. And if you sell 10,000 copies of that comic book, come back to us and we'll make your movie. So he walked out of that meeting super bummed, not just because they didn't want to make the movie, but they said make a comic book. And guess what? He was a screenwriter. He didn't know how to make a comic book, right? Which, if this was 1992, that would have been a big bummer. But because it was 2017, he was able to go home, open up the laptop, Google, how do I make a comic book? And he started reading. And he started finding out where the artists hung out online and the artist communities and ArtStation and DeviantArt and things like that. He's learned the production workflow, the cost of making a comic book, how they were distributed. He just started researching, and he connected with an artist in like Estonia or some Eastern European country that they decided to collaborate on something. They scraped and put one issue of a comic book together. It took them months. They put one issue of a comic together, and they distributed it digitally on Amazon, and made enough money from it to make an issue 2. And then they made enough money on it to make an issue 3. And then they made enough money on it to make an issue 4. And then after issue 4, guess what happened? They got picked up by a small independent publisher that said, we'll pay for the publishing of it, right? So they did issue 5. And then after issue 5, they're putting it all together as a trade paperback, all 5 issues together. And now, 4 years later, he's right on the verge of his 10,000 unit sale, right? And he says, Houston, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back to Paramount Pictures and tell them to make my movie because I have to hit the $10,000 or the 10,000 sale mark, right? But guess what? I'm not going to stop selling my comic book. Why? Because it's an extra source of revenue for me. And I have a community of fans that love this stuff, right? So why would I stop? And so now he self-identifies as not just a screenwriter, but he's a screenwriter / comic book creator, right? He's, there's this term called polymath, right? People that are good at multiple things. And we typically laud people in entertainment that can do more, right? Beyonce can sing and she can dance, and J-Lo can act and sing and dance. And we always say, all these people are amazing. They're entrepreneurs and actors and singers and creators. And, and we love that about people. We need to start looking at ourselves as that because we have the ability to do that. And because all the tools are in front of us. So I think that's the model that we have to hit is being willing to have that mindset shift of, I need to learn some more. I need to broaden my own skill set, right? But when I do, it's going to open up a new world for me because I'm able to establish my IP in the market.
Why don't we see new ideas in Hollywood?
I think it's because of risk. I think when you look at the risk analysis of feature films or television, there's a hesitancy of taking a chance on a new idea. You have to think about Hollywood as not in a vacuum, where there's all these middle managers in Hollywood. They're all executives, right? And there's 100 people that are all involved in everything in the decision of what to make and what not to make. And by and large, people don't make those decisions based on what's going to propel the industry forward creatively, and what's going to be, what does the artistic integrity of the industry need? And they're not asking those questions. They're asking the questions of, what can I do not to get fired from my job? And if it's a lot easier for these executives to say no to something that could potentially be risky than to say yes to something that could be potentially risky and it not work out, and all of a sudden they get the blame because they took the risk. I mean, if I'm a studio executive and I have two scripts in front of me, and one is this really hip, interesting, progressive, edgy, script that really pushes boundaries in a really interesting way, does a lot of creative, edgy, interesting things, and then I have the reboot of the Brady Bunch as a feature film, starring Vince Vaughn as Greg Brady, which actually sounds kind of good. But but if I have that in front of me, and it's like solidly mediocre, right? But if I have those two things in front of me, the most artistically interesting choice is the new idea. Let's promote new ideas. Let's not go back to the well in the Brady Bunch, right? But 99 times out of 100, what's going to happen is we're going to remake the Brady Bunch, not because we think the Brady Bunch is going to be better, or one, it has pre-awareness in the market, right? So it has a community of people that already know what the Brady Bunch is. Even if you haven't seen an episode of the Brady Bunch, odds are people have heard of the Brady Bunch. And so there's this market awareness that shifts the risk, and they think it's a safer bet. And because it's the safer bet, they think if I push my chips in on the Brady Bunch and it gets made and it doesn't do as well as we think, I'll still be able to keep my job because I made the safe decision. But if I go all in on a completely original idea, that is the more artistically interesting idea, and it doesn't work, guess what? Who's on the chopping block? Me, for making the bad call, right? And listen, it may not be my fault, maybe other people's fault, but everybody's kind of shifting the blame. Everybody wants to blame somebody, and especially on the executive level, it's you could only lose $50 million of somebody else's money so many times before they don't give you $50 million to lose anymore, right? And so it's tough, that decision to greenlight or not to greenlight, but that's not made in a vacuum. They sit there and say, how do I keep my nice six-figure salary with my premium health insurance? And how do I keep my kids in private school? And how do I keep my wife not having to work and do the things that she likes to do? And how do I keep my house in my gated community? And how do I keep, the two cars that I have? And what are the decisions that can preserve that? And I'm going to do those, because then if I do those long enough, eventually my boss will retire and maybe I get it promoted, and then it becomes that game. And listen, I'm not even criticizing those people for doing that. Maybe I do that if I'm in the same situation. I have kids, I got a house, I got a wife, I got dogs, I got things, right? So, and I don't want to get fired. We need health insurance. Like, there's all these other pressures that come in. But if you now look at the entire industry as an industry that is motivated not on artistic integrity, but how do I keep my job? That really clues you in of why we don't see a lot of new stuff. That's why we see reboots. And listen, largely reboots don't work. We saw that with female Ghostbusters. We saw that with the new Terminator movie. We saw that, we've seen that every now and then they work, right? Hawaii Five-0 worked, I think. There's some that 21 Jump Street, I think, worked. Actually, the times you actually see it work, I think, is when you shift platform. If it was originally a movie, then they turn it into a TV show, or originally a TV show and they turn it into a film. That usually works more than film to film or show to show, typically, just as an anecdotal observation. But it's largely reboots don't work that well in the industry. If you just look at the numbers. So why do they do it? It's because it's the safer bet. But even though we know it's not a safe bet, it looks like the safer bet. So when people come to blame somebody, I can say, whoa, no, everybody knew the Brady Bunch. It's not my fault. It's Vince Vaughn's fault. It's the director's fault. It's somebody else's fault but mine, right? So then I get to stay in my gated community. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, look, the executives, I was talking to the president of, he had a really interesting comment. He said, executives, they live in the gated communities, and then they leave their gated communities and drive through the gate into the lot, and then work, and then they drive back to their gated communities and never go east of Robertson, right? And they live in this weird little bubble that breeds a different mentality than, than the consumer or the audience, or, when we're saying, why don't we have any more ideas? It's not our money on the line, right? It's easy to say there should be new ideas. We shouldn't make so many superhero movies. It's not our money. Like, it's easy to say that if it was your $50 million or $100 million that you're actually putting on the line, maybe that conversation changes, right? Because now you're like, maybe I don't want to take the risk on the progressively interesting, edgy, psychological thriller that doesn't have any pre-awareness in the market. Maybe it will end up being one of the coolest, most artistic films that we've seen in the last 10 years. But we've all seen movies like that not be financial successes. This is how they turn into cult classics, right? And we see movies and we're like, how did that not work? Why doesn't everybody see this? And there's 1,000 reasons why great films aren't commercial successes. And not being a commercial success doesn't not make you a great film artistically, of course, right? But when it's your money on the line, it's a different story, right? And so you have to, and when it's your job on the line, when you're spending when it's your job to spend someone else's money, which puts your job on the line, the calculation changes, right? I think I had a situation where I pitched a TV show to a studio, and they were looking for content for their digital extension of their network, and they told me what they were looking for. I pitched this idea. It was to a producer, had a pod deal with the network, and he said, "This is perfect. I love it. This is exactly what we're looking for." And I'm super excited because I think, oh well, this deal's done. This is great. And he said, "What book is this based off of?" And I said, "Oh, it's not based off a book. It's an original idea." And his whole body language changed. He like slumped down and says, "Oh, yeah, it needs to be based on a book." And I said, "No, it doesn't, because you love it and you think it's perfect and it's exactly what you need. So we're good, right?" And he said, "No, it needs to be based on a book." So is it possible that we could find a book that already exists that is kind of like the idea? We can option that book and then say this idea is based on that book. And I said, this is the stupidest conversation I've ever had with anybody in my whole life. You said it's perfect. You said it's exactly what you're looking for. You love it. What's the problem? And he said, "Houston, I do love it. It is exactly what I'm looking for. It is exactly what we need. But the fact of the matter is, I am not going to take something to my boss that's not based on a book because I don't want to put my job on the line for you." That's exactly what he told me. And I said, "I appreciate your honesty." I really honestly did appreciate that insight. I got it. I expected this guy to go out on a limb, stick his neck out for an idea and an IP that wasn't established in the marketplace, didn't have any community built around it, didn't have any market presence. It was risky. And I expected him to assume my risk, which puts his job on the line. And he didn't feel comfortable with that because he didn't care about the art. I'm gonna say he didn't care about the art. He didn't just care about the art. I mean, of course he wanted to make a good show, right? But there was other considerations that were very practical. He wanted to keep his job. And we forget that. We forget that in the music industry, the A&R executives, there's a lot of undiscovered talent that may be better than other people, but all of a sudden, I'm going to sign the TikTok star that is much worse than this undiscovered talent because the TikTok star has 12 million people that follow the TikTok star on TikTok. Therefore, if the TikTok star washes out, it's not my fault because I took the safe bet rather than I go out and pluck the undiscovered dude from Iowa that doesn't have any following. He washes out. Guess what? It's on me because I took the risk. I took a risk and I lost. And so the calculation changes. Then this is why somebody like Jake Paul or Logan Paul, they can go out and they can fight these named boxers. They can go out and fight Floyd Mayweather. I mean, did Logan Paul fight Floyd Mayweather because he's the best, most deserving boxer in the world? No. He did it, he was able to do that because it was a safe bet. Like he had pre-awareness in the market and then just made sense. And so like it just, that's just the fact of the matter of it, right? Like it's just Jake Paul can go and write a script and sell that script to a major studio faster than 99% of independent screenwriters in Hollywood right now that are 19,000 times more talented than Jake Paul. No offense to Jake Paul. He may be a closet screenwriter. I'm not sure. I don't think he is. But you get what I'm saying is it's not because he's better. It's because he's safer. And the executives know that. The executives know that. And they don't think that Jake Paul will write better stuff. But they think if they bet on Jake Paul rather than you, if Jake Paul doesn't work, they can keep their job. So we always, as creators, as filmmakers, we always have to understand the business of the business and understand the very human calculation that is going on in the executive level or the investment level or the people that are behind the desk. It's not, these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. It's not just what's going to make the best movie. Unfortunately, that's not the case anymore, right? Maybe it was back in 1977, maybe it was a different mentality that went into executives, but today's executives, it's a high stakes, high pressure environment, and there's real careers on the line. There's real families that rely on real salaries, and we just think, well, as long as our concept's right, and as long as our 3-act structure works, and as long as our character development's right, then if I am able to execute the art the right way, then they should make my idea. And it's just, and then you get frustrated when they don't, and then you see crappy movies that are released that are reboots, and you're like, oh, where's the original ideas? It's just a more complicated, very human calculation that's going on that's different than the calculation you think is going on.
Well, and people are voting with their dollars. Someone's seeing it, whether they're the ones that are also leaving a gated community to go into the gated, parking lot at the local Cineplex. Someone's buying these tickets. And so whether they just are checking their phone the entire time or not, and they're just going to appease their kids or their friends, is not to be known right now, but so someone is seeing these things. So that's the hard part. And the ones that these art house films or these very unique, edgy indie dramas, whatever, unfortunately, they're people aren't always voting with their dollars to show that they love that. So.
Sure. And listen, and you're right. The market decides. The market decides what it likes and what it doesn't like. And that's the way normal business works. That's the way the world works. The market decides what works and what doesn't. And we can't just sit back and make value judgments and say, well, my movie was better than that. Well, the market has decided that it's not. Now, artistically speaking, that's maybe a different consideration. This is the difference between the Oscars and the People's Choice Awards, or just look at the box office. Like, really, I mean, they don't give out the Oscars just based. Best Picture could be what was the highest achieving box office picture of the year. They don't do that. They look at the art, and there's artistic achievement that's the focus of the Oscars. But really, the regular audience member, again, I'm from Kentucky. I'm not from the coast. And now that I've been on the coast for 15 years, I realize it's a different mentality. When you're in Hollywood, people seen all the Oscar movies, and they've seen all the streaming shows and all the deep cuts, and they can, but you go to Middle America, you go to Wyoming, you go to Kentucky, you go to Ohio, you go to Georgia. It's there, people don't know the directors, they don't know the DPs, and they don't know, all the deep cut indie films, and they haven't seen, David Lynch's third movie he made out of film school. And but when you live in the bubble of Hollywood, maybe New York, right? You convince yourself that everybody thinks this way, and you start making stuff for people in the bubble, right? Listen, not saying that you just have to make, so the quote unquote studio crap, the quote unquote big commercial high concept film. You don't have to make superheroes all the time. There is room for art, but I think ultimately you need to figure out how to marry art and commerciality. There's an intersection that can happen, and when that happens, that's magic. It never ceases to surprise me of how many filmmakers fight for the right to be a starving artist, and they find pride in it. And I can never understand it. I would much rather them be well-fed artists, still be an artist, but figure out how to operate in a commercial environment where the audience will vote with their dollars. I feel like we have to find that intersection. Something like A Quiet Place was I think a good example of that. I thought it was a very well-made, interesting, artistic, very, very different choice of how to do a monster movie, and very almost risky in a way, but it had commercial sensibility and it worked. And you look at something like Ted Lasso. I think, Ted Lasso, I feel like is a really interesting commercial success that isn't Game of Thrones, right? But at the same time isn't The Office, or I feel like it's an interesting thing. If you look at what's going on in the Emmys, the people that are cleaning up the Emmys, it was The Crown and the Queen's Gambit, right? The Queen's Gambit was a huge commercial success. But at the same time, I think it was a wild artistic success as well. I feel like it fit that intersection. And I feel like that's what a lot of independent filmmakers struggle with, is finding that intersection. But because they need to think outside the bubble. And listen, ultimately, you got to make what's in your heart and make what drives you and sustains you, right? And so, but it's it becomes difficult when you're making stuff that the market doesn't bear, right? And if you're happy with that and you're fine with that, Mazel tov, that's great. But ultimately, I feel like we need to figure out that intersection. And if you can, again, it goes back to that pre-awareness conversation. If you can figure out how to take that interesting, super artistic, edgy IP, if that people don't want to touch because it's too risky, if you're able to establish that in the market in 3 or 4 different ways, or even one way, like you establish it as a podcast and it pops as a podcast, and now 100,000 people subscribe to that podcast, guess what? It's the same edgy, progressive, artistic character drama idea, but now all of a sudden the studios are going to now be more apt to take a gamble on that original idea because you're able to establish it in the marketplace first, right? So I think that approach really benefits people that don't just want to make superhero movies or Marvel movies or zombie movies or vampire movies or whatever, the big genre flicks or whatever it is. They want to do some different artistic, interesting things. Even more, these people have to embrace all the tools in the toolbox. They have to figure out how to establish in the marketplace. Let's prove the audience. And once we can prove the audience, then all of a sudden these people that were nervous about taking a flyer on it are going to be a lot less nervous because they see that you've proven yourself in the marketplace. I had an investor that said that told me every single movie that is pitched to him, he has the filmmakers go, he said he'll invest, if he decides to invest, he will only invest 80%. And it's 80% finishing funds. And he makes the filmmakers go and raise 20%, the first 20% of the budget on Kickstarter, right? And it's one, I think he's testing the horsepower of the filmmaker, but really what he's looking for is you need to prove that there's a market. You need to prove to me that there are people that will actually get behind this thing. And if there's people that actually get behind this thing, guess what? Okay, cool. I'll come up with the other 80%. But you gotta generate the market first, right? And so I think if you are one of the filmmakers that have the edgier, non-commercial idea, then you have to figure out a way to get that story and that IP to as many people as you can, aggregate the data and the analytics of the audience, and then use that to soften the risk analysis that was probably well against you, was working against you, but now you can shift that now to potentially, depending on the success, to actually working for you in a great way.
And two, with the Queen's Gambit, as sort of edgy and artistic as it was, Walter Tevis had already proven himself with The Hustler.
Sure.
And then is it The Man Who Fell from Earth?
Yep.
And I'm not sure how all that fared, but so there was a succession of successes, I guess you could call it. And so if it had just been an obscure screenwriter who wrote the exact same thing,
sure,
would they have taken a chance on it, as amazing as it was?
Well, this is what they tell you when you go shop a script that's unbranded content, right? They'll say you need to go package this. You need to find attachments to this, and you need to go find an actor that will say, I'll act in this, or you need to find a director that says, I'll direct this, or producer that says, I'll produce this. And if you get the attachments involved, now all of a sudden, they may take a chance on an original idea that's unbranded, that's not based on anything else, because they're getting the pre-awareness from the talent rather than the IP, right? So, yeah, if you can get, if you can get Julia Roberts to say, "Hey, I'm in," or get Michael B. Jordan said, "I'll be in that. That'd be great." Or get The Rock to say, "I'll produce it and star in it." Right? If you can get that, then the game changes for you. The problem with that, the practical problem with that, is it's difficult to get attachments. It's hard. Talk to any agents, and the agents will tell you, they'll say, their clients have scripts. The people they rep, they have a stack of script that's taller than my 7-year-old that they're waiting for them to read to decide what to attach to. And then that's the ones that actually get to them, right? It's how do you get to these people, right? How do you like for the mere mortal filmmaker? How do you get to Michael B. Jordan? How do you get your script to Michael B. Jordan, especially if you're unrepped? Now, if you have a manager or an agent, then you expect your agent to figure out how to connect with their agent and make the submission and things like that. But especially if you're unrepped, it's like it's in the impossibility unless you see him at a club and you get into conversation, or your sister is friends with his cousin, and one of those weird, you got to know people type of thing, right? That Hollywood works, with in a lot of ways. But it's hard to get those attachments. I had a buddy who was a professional house sitter for celebrities when they go out of town. Like, he's licensed and bonded as a house sitter, which is, God bless America that can even be a thing. But so he goes out and when these celebrities go out of town, he'll stay at their house, feed their dogs, feed their parrot, things like that, and then there's somebody there in case they get robbed, or they think they won't get robbed if somebody's in the house. So, but he was telling me that he was staying at an actor's house who was an A-list actor in the 70s, late 70s. Now is older, probably a C-list actor, at this point, not, doesn't do a lot of stuff, but used to be, everybody knows him, it's a big name, right? And he told me, he said he would receive courier packages of scripts, and he would open them up, take the script out, open up a room and throw it in. And there was this huge pile of scripts there that this guy was supposed to be reading through in order to decide what to attach to. What's going to be your next movie, right? And it's just like so frustrating for writers, and because we're writing this stuff and we send it out and we think, okay, The Rock's going to read this, and I'm just waiting for The Rock to get back to me, and Tom Hanks is going to maybe be in my movie, maybe not, right? But now it's 150 scripts before he'll get to your script, and who knows when that is. It's a hard game to get attachments, right? If you can get attachments, great. But I like to now say, I'm gonna now approach IP in a way that that I'm gonna presume I don't get any big attachments. I'm not gonna not try to get attachments. Of course, you attempt to get attachments, but I'm gonna presume I don't. And so that if I do, it's gravy. It's not the entree. I'm not betting on it, right? And so I'm going to try to attack the market, build the IP with pre-awareness as much as I can, with the mindset that I'll never get attachments, so that I can skew the risk analysis myself through the aggregation of the audience, And then if Jennifer Lawrence decides to be in the movie, then even better. It's gravy, right? It's the icing on the cake, not the cake itself, right? But that shows you the pre-awareness has to come from somewhere. It's either coming from the talent or it's either coming from the IP, but it has to come from somewhere, right? Unless, this is my eternal caveat to that, horror movies. Horror movies are this really bizarre exception. Somebody like Jason Blum they can make a horror movie with nobody you've ever heard of, with a director you've never heard of, with a story that's never been established in the marketplace, and you can still make those movies, and they can still make money at the box office, and horror movies defy all those rules for whatever reason. Which is interesting. The horror genre is very specific about that. If you come up with a concept that's great, and the visual concept that goes along with it, and figure out a wildly creative way to kill people and things like that, then you can still get that stuff made. So which is great for the horror industry. Everything but the horror outside of the horror industry operates on pre-awareness in a major way.
I actually like that idea for a movie, that the house sitter, and the guy goes in and starts reading these scripts because he's bored and he has all this time and he's supposed to stay there, and then he starts writing himself. Because he doesn't take anybody's ideas, but he says, you know what, I want to do a screenplay, and it gets made.
I love it.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, you should write that. I like
it. Well, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. Just establish it in the market.
I'll check with your friend first.
That's it. Yeah, for sure.
Houston, what are your thoughts on Hollywood reboots? What are we doing wrong? What are we doing right?
I think reboots, in general, I'm not a huge fan of them. I think in large respect, people talk about they ruined my childhood and things like that. Like we have nostalgia about the things that we loved before, but at the same time, reboots reintroduce the story to a new generation that wouldn't necessarily go back and watch an older film, and we have to understand that reality of it. If I loved Ghostbusters when I was a kid, but I tried to show Ghostbusters to my little girl, and it just wasn't jibing with her. Like it's different filmmaking, different storytelling styles in different eras, right? I mean, even with Star Wars, the original Star Wars, she just thinks it's like a weird old movie because the filmmaking's so different now, right? And so she likes the new Star Wars movies more than the old Star Wars movies. When I think artistically, the old Star Wars movies were better. But with reboots, I think is there a generation of kids that will actually go back and watch the old 21 Jump Street series? Probably not. Should they? Yeah, of course they should. Of course, yeah. But will they? Probably not. And so that means there's going to be a generation of kids that don't know the 21 Jump Street story. And so rebooting 21 Jump Street in a different way reintroduces the IP to a new generation. So in that regard, I'm down with it. I like it. I think, though, what's better is let's figure out how to do a soft reboot, but still extend the story. I think that's the sweet spot. And you really look to see, something like what J.J. Abrams did with Star Wars with The Force Awakens. He essentially rebooted Star Wars without rebooting Star Wars. He technically told a new story, but if you look at the way that movie was structured and the story and the characters, it was basically a soft reboot of Star Wars for people that haven't seen Star Wars. And it basically retold A New Hope just in a very new and different way. But at the same time, for legacy fans, it still extended the story for us. So technically, it was new story for us. Didn't ruin our childhood because they weren't just wiping away the old and reestablishing the new. And that's what fans don't like about reboots. They're saying the thing that we love before is now no more. We're erasing that from canon, and we're now creating this new thing, and we're going to start here. Comic book fans, it's referred to as a renumbering. When there was Superman 731, issue 731, they'll say we're going to renumber, we're going to start over number 1, which means we're going to wipe out the canon of all the old stuff. That's always painful for fans to do. But that's essentially what reboots do. They say the old Hawaii Five-0 is no longer. Now it's the new Hawaii Five-0. And the fans of the old get surly about that because they're precious and there's nostalgia and there's memories attached to it and things like that. Even though, technically is the new stuff better because there's better filmmaking techniques and better technology. Maybe, probably, that's a subjective call, right? But I think the sweet spot is let's figure out how to do soft reboots that extend for legacy audience, but create a new entry point in for a new audience. Find that intersection. If you look at what they're doing with the Ghostbusters, and my little girl didn't like the old Ghostbusters, then the female Ghostbusters that when that dropped, that just didn't work because Ghostbusters fans rejected it because they're saying, wait a minute, like those aren't my Ghostbusters. I love Dan Aykroyd and I love, I love my Ghostbusters. Where's Egon and all that? Like that's the kind of nerdy stuff that fans get into. Now, there's also the layer of, the misogynistic, these are women and we didn't like that. There's that whole sort of political angle to it. But I think in a large degree, legacy Ghostbusters fans just didn't like their Ghostbusters being deleted for new Ghostbusters. I think if it was all men, it probably wouldn't have worked either, right? May have been a different commentary around it. Listen, and of course, I'm not denying the fact that there were people that were just misogynistic jerks about the whole thing. Of course, there was that. I don't know if that was the bulk of it. I think it just wouldn't work regardless because that movie is so precious to so many people but now it's a whole different conversation with the new Ghostbusters movies that's coming out, which effectively is a reboot of Ghostbusters for people who have never seen Ghostbusters, but it still extends Ghostbusters for people that have seen Ghostbusters, the legacy audience, right? And so you have to try to find that sweet spot, I think, of how do we extend and continue rather than stop, delete, and then restart, right? And so I think is a better way forward than just the hard reboot. And maybe there's a different term for it, but I think you have to get a buy-in from a legacy audience, especially something like iconic like Ghostbusters, right? That has a fan community around it. Maybe there wasn't a fan community around Hawaii Five-0, or maybe there was, I'm not sure. But things that have actual fan community around it, I really feel like you have to continue rather than just restart and delete everything that's old. I mean, they're facing this with the reboot of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, and which is crazy. They're already talking about rebooting Pirates of the Caribbean. I feel like it was just out 5 minutes ago, but it's going to be a hard reboot, which means they're just going to start over and start telling different stories with a new Jack Sparrow, and that's that. For all the fans that love Johnny Depp as Jack Sparrow and all those old movies, then that's going to be a hard, tough pill to swallow, to say all this stuff that I love doesn't count anymore. And because now it's this new thing and there's going to be a division in the fandom. You can't divide fandom like that and expect to be a success. And so yeah, I'm not ideologically against reboots of like all reboots are terrible. I think some are smart and some reintroduce fans to new stuff. Like, what if would I ever want them to reboot The Princess Bride? No, right? But do kids today go back and watch The Princess Bride? Will they ever? Maybe. I don't know. Like that's the calculation, right? But I think it would be better to do The Princess Bride now, so many years later, that extends the original, but still is a soft entry point for new fans, but still serves the legacy audience. How do we find that balance? I'm not saying it's easy. J.J. Abrams did it with Force Awakens, did it really well. And I think the Ghostbusters is doing that really well. But it's not easy. It's a balancing act. But I feel like in today's fandom-driven market, you got to find that balance.
Do you still love Star Wars now the same way you did when you first saw it in a theater or wherever you were?
Absolutely. I consider myself just a huge Star Wars fan. I love Star Wars. I am wildly not objective about Star Wars. But it's interesting from I try to be objective about Star Wars, but I find myself loving it anyway. And I go back and I look at Star Wars, and I recently read the script of Episode 1 of Phantom Menace, and may have been the worst script I've ever read. Like, it's just a really bad script, in my opinion. It was just it's terrible. I still love the movie. And it's interesting. I think, you look at some artistic decisions, how you watch Black Swan, and then you see how did George Lucas turn Natalie Portman into a bad actress? Like, how did that even, like Ewan McGregor, Liam Neeson, and Natalie Portman, how do you turn those people into, and Samuel L. Jackson, how do you turn them into bad actors that are wooden and stiff? Like, that's hard to do. He did that. They weren't that great. Think of the artistic choice of the second Death Star in Return of the Jedi. I was thinking about that the other day. You have the Death Star in the first movie, and then you get to the third movie, and the central plot is around a second Death Star. That in today's market, I think, would be just like laughed at, and people would say it's lazy writing and doesn't make a lot of sense. But I love it. I love the original movies. I love the prequel trilogy. I love the new movies that were a mess in a lot of ways. I feel like the Rise of Skywalker was 3 movies shoved into 2 hours, and it was pacing issues and all this stuff, but I still love it. And that's I think the magic of Star Wars, is that Star Wars doesn't have to be perfect. It taps into this youthful whimsy, this your imagination and things just take over, and it takes you to this childlike place where you don't have to be objectively filmmakery when you watch Star Wars, right? And of course I want the movies to be good, and of course you want the craft to be great. But Star Wars is Star Wars, and I'm still a huge fan. I'm a fan of what they're doing, on the streaming stuff with the Mandalorian and everything else. But for me, Star Wars is like an old box, and like an old empty box. And me as a dad, I have a 7-year-old and a 6-month-old. And it's interesting. Like, I'll look at an empty box as an old empty box, but a kid looks at that empty box and it becomes a spaceship, or it becomes a carriage, or it becomes a tank, or it becomes a castle, or it becomes all of those in the course of 25 minutes, right? I think Star Wars is like that old empty box. To some filmmakers and writers and artists and critics, they say, there's nothing special about that. That's not great. I don't get it. It's just a box. But for me, when I look at Star Wars, I look at it like the 7-year-old looking at the empty box. Say, no, that's not a box. That's an airplane, right? That's a spaceship. And it takes a different lens to look through it. And so, I am unabashed of my love for The Last Jedi, right? Which is the most divisive Star Wars film ever. Rian Johnson's Episode 9. I loved it. I didn't love everything about it, but I loved it. I loved The Rise of Skywalker. I loved it. Did I love everything about it? Of course not. Did I love everything about Return of the Jedi? Of course not. But I still love the movie as a whole. I think that fandom has gotten to a point of this deconstructionism of people pick on things and they say, this doesn't, I mean, think back with Game of Thrones, and last season of Game of Thrones gave us, the Battle of Winterfell gave us one of the most dramatic, interesting, coolest episodes of TV ever filmed ever in history, and the only thing people could talk about the next day was the coffee cup they left in the scene. And because that's today's thing, like that's just the way the internet is, and that's just the way Twitter is, and people like to deconstruct it and say, oh, that's lazy, or they fumbled the landing or whatever, they didn't end it right. J.J. Abrams didn't do this right, he didn't get this character right. I don't like how Rian Johnson did Luke Skywalker in this, and they nitpick, and things could be different, and things aren't perfect, and we don't love everything, but ultimately, I'm a fan, and I love it because it's just, it's escapism, and I try, honestly, as a professional, and I think all of us professionals understand how difficult it is to make anything, and how like it's a miracle that any movie ever gets made ever. And so I've learned to even look at quote unquote bad films and still appreciate them. Like, wow, they actually made that. Even though it's terrible and I didn't necessarily enjoy it, they still made it. And the fact that that anything gets made, I'm going to appreciate it. And if I can't do better than that, I try not to criticize it and say that's garbage or that's lazy or whatever. Again, I don't love everything about it, but ultimately I look at the Star Wars films and just with immense respect for how they've been able to keep that IP alive over 60 years or 50 years, however long it's been, how much they've been able to scale the brand, how long they've been able to sustain the fan community and create the culture that they have, to continue to push artistic boundaries of what they're doing with The Mandalorian and the volumetric capture stage that they built, and just, the storytelling of The Mandalorian, what they're doing now with all the crossover stuff that on Disney Plus is absolutely incredible. You have somebody like a character like Ahsoka Tano. I'm gonna get Star Wars nerdy for a second. You have a character like Ahsoka Tano, who's a character from the Clone Wars animated series that they then pull into a different animated series, Star Wars Rebels, that they then pull into a live action series of The Mandalorian, and cast a live action actress, and now going to spin her off to her own live action series on Disney Plus. What they're doing from in a transmedia sense is just really super interesting, and how they revived the Star Wars. It's not like it was dead, but like the way they brought Star Wars back in front of culture with Baby Yoda, and now we know as Grogu, but everybody was talking about Baby Yoda, just a cultural sensation of Baby Yoda. It's just a really smart, interesting choices that they make, and especially now with they have something now called Star Wars Visions, where it's animated short films that are all created in the manga style. So you like Japanese animation. It's all done with manga creators telling manga stories in the Star Wars universe that are very much catered to a completely new market, a younger market, a more Eastern market where Star Wars hasn't been able to really get a foothold as a brand very much, and it works, and it's good, and it's powerful storytelling, and so I appreciate them as a fan, I appreciate them as a filmmaker, and I appreciate them as somebody who understands how to build and sustain IP. Like the way they do it is just a masterclass on how to keep an engine like that running, and not just running, but thriving in the midst of multiple decades. This really is a tremendous thing. And it all goes back to how George Lucas created and built the whole thing. It's really like he approached it in a unique way, and they've continued to keep that going.
Do you think dividing the fandom is by design?
I don't think it's by design. I think it's a byproduct of today's toxic fandom, that is just a thing that goes on now. But I think if you were to criticize Lucasfilm for something, it's with the movies. They didn't listen to the fandom. Not saying that the Star Wars fans should decide what's in the Star Wars movies. I'm very much certain that if Star Wars fans somehow collectively decided what the next Star Wars movie was going to be, it would be terrible. There is artistic integrity and autonomy with the filmmakers, but if you look at somebody like Kathleen Kennedy is she's an old school filmmaker. She's an old school filmmakers producer. You know, the way she used to produce, old, Steven Spielberg stuff. And she's very much a filmmakers producer. She likes to let the filmmakers run and make great movies. And I think part of the misstep of the latest trilogy has been in her letting the filmmakers kind of run with their own visions, and the Lego blocks don't fit together with the trilogy as well, and not really being in tune with the fandom and what the fandom, the directions and what the expectations are, and being able to set the expectations with the fandom, and not that you can please everybody, of course you can't, but with something like Star Wars, you just can't approach it in the way you would any other movie. It's just a whole other organism that you have to understand, that the fans are part of the process now. And setting expectation and avoiding cognitive dissonance is a really important thing with understanding how fandoms work. So if I were to go to the south of France for a vacation, and I get there and it's overcast and rainy and cold and super expensive and everybody's grouchy and not very nice, I would come back from that vacation very upset and frustrated. Wasn't a great vacation. But if I go to New York City and it's overcast and cold and rainy and really expensive and everybody's grouchy, guess what? That's New York City. Like I'm not frustrated at that a bit. That's the New York City experience. The difference is, what's your expectation? And so if I have the expectation that it's going to be warm and bright and sunny and everybody's going to be sweet and nice, and it's the opposite of that, that's where frustration kicks in because of cognitive dissonance. And so managing expectation of audiences and letting them know the direction that we're going and some of the things we're trying to achieve, and letting them have a voice and making them part of the conversation and helping shape some sort of expectation in their mind. Not saying plot points or things like that or big reveals. I'm sorry, just general direction that the franchise is heading. That conversation is super important to have with fandoms today, and that's something that Lucasfilm and Kathleen Kennedy didn't do when it came to the sequel trilogy, as they call it. And you see now all of a sudden, when I think everybody was on board for Force Awakens, but then when Rian Johnson did The Last Jedi and Luke Skywalker didn't act like people thought Luke Skywalker should act, and there were some choices that were made that were surprising and didn't go and then all of a sudden Rise of Skywalker went in some different directions. That started to divide the fandom, and some people loved it, some people hated it, and they all couldn't agree. But there wasn't enough community building. I think they just took the community for granted. I think they said, as long as we give them a Star Wars movie, everything will work out, and it just it didn't work. But that being said, Kathleen Kennedy gave us The Mandalorian. Kathleen Kennedy gave us Rogue One, which I think is one of the best Star Wars movies ever made. Kathleen Kennedy is giving us. She brought in Jon Favreau for The Mandalorian. She's the Book of Boba Fett. She's overseeing all that. Like, Kathleen Kennedy, I think, has done more good things than bad things. It just so happens that I think the misstep was on the biggest stage with the new trilogy, because Star Wars really is built around trilogies, and that's the legacy of Star Wars. And so you have to nail those. I think we could fumble some Disney Plus series, and the fans would gripe about it, but you can't fumble the trilogy. And I'm not saying it's a complete fumble, but it wasn't as good as it should have been from a trilogy standpoint. There should have been. She should have made sure that there was a creative vision and a creative plan that was in place before they even started the first movie, and they were able to see that through. So there would be Lego blocks that connected in the best possible way. Make sure the community was on board and understood the direction that we're going in to avoid the cognitive dissonance, and that didn't happen. So that being said, the movie is still wildly successful, but ultimately it created this division in the fan base But The Mandalorian kind of brought them all back together. And so even though you may hate Last Jedi and I love Last Jedi, we can all high five on Baby Yoda, right? And so that's been I think a really good thing for the fandom is The Mandalorian's kind of brought it all back. So
should Star Wars ever make another trilogy?
Oh, absolutely. I think they should make 100 more trilogies as long as the market it will bear it. As long as Star Wars fans want more Star Wars movies, absolutely. If Star Wars fans don't want more Star Wars movies, then no, right? The market should decide whether they should make more or whether they shouldn't make more. I would love more, right? And I think we're gonna see more. I think we're gonna see standalone movies, and I think we're gonna see trilogies. I think the trilogies will be approached differently moving forward. But Patty Jenkins is coming in. You know, she did Wonder Woman, both the Wonder Woman movies. She's doing a Rogue Squadron film, which should be great. Kevin Feige is going to be producing a Star Wars film. Taika Waititi is writing his own Star Wars movie. Rian Johnson, from what I've read, still has Star Wars, a trilogy that they're going to allow him to do, which will probably be super divisive. But I think if you give him a trilogy that's just his, it works a lot better, right? Especially after this, what we're seeing, like his success in Knives Out and things like that. Since then, I think has changed his star power a little bit to where I think people trust him a little bit more with it than maybe they did before. Or at least they should, because Knives Out is great, and Knives Out 2 should be great as well. I'm a big Rian Johnson fan. If you go back to Brick and things like that, he's just great. But yeah, absolutely, 100%. They should continue to make trilogies. They should continue to make standalone. They should continue to do animation. They should continue to do live action series, games, board games, video games, novels. What they're doing right now in the publishing space is super, super, super impressive with what they call the High Republic, the High Republic part of the universe, which is thousands of years before the prequel trilogy. You go back to the days where the Jedi were like the Wild West sheriffs, in sort of this really rough part of the galaxy, and they have coordinated with multiple authors and multiple comic creators and multiple novelists, and they all have worked out this tremendous publishing plan where they're publishing adult novels, YA novels, junior novels, comic books that all tie in together to create one big publishing experience that then is going to spin into a live action show for Disney Plus that's going to be called The Acolyte, which is going to be set in the High Republic era, which they just also announced a new video game that's going to be set in the Knights of the Old Republic, supposedly set in the similar time, and probably become the new trilogy. I think part of the problem with the sequel trilogy, outside of the Lego blocks not fitting together because the plan wasn't installed, is you're dealing with legacy characters that everybody cares about. Luke Skywalker and Han Solo and Princess Leia and Chewbacca. And so all of a sudden, everybody has ideas of how those characters should go and what we should do with them. And you can't kill that one, but you should kill that one, things like that. I think any new trilogy needs to unhitch from those legacy characters and establish new characters and new stories in different parts of the galaxy, dealing with different things. And so you don't have all that legacy baggage. That's why I think The Mandalorian worked, is because it didn't have to deal with any of those legacy characters. And we all like, okay, we don't have any expectations anymore of how Luke Skywalker's story should end. We can all just enjoy this new ride together. And so I think that will probably be the way of a new trilogy. But who knows? I mean, right? I mean, who knows the way it'll go? I mean, if Star Wars is sort of built around this idea of pulling in, the crossover of different things and taking minor characters from the background of this one scene in A New Hope, and now we're going to make that a major character in The Mandalorian, and that's cool for fandoms. And there's this very incestuous approach to Star Wars, which maybe is not the best word to use, but maybe is the right word, since Luke and Leia actually kiss, and then you find out they're brother and sister, which is all, again, one of those weird things that we just love Star Wars, so we overlook. But it's very connected in the way the way Lucas always dynamically connected all the stuff, and the Lucasfilm with what they call the story group, which is the team that oversees the connection between all the different video games and movies and TV shows, how it all works together. So there will always be connection and crossover, but I think moving past those legacy characters is going to create a more forgiving perspective on a new trilogy that they didn't have with the sequel trilogy. Even though they had different protagonists, the fact that Luke Skywalker was in there and Han Solo was in there, and JJ killed Han Solo in Force Awakens, and it just like freaked so many people out. Even though I thought it was kind of a powerful, interesting moment in the movie, it really just made a lot of people mad because they love Han Solo and we think they should never die. And Star Wars fans are weird like that, but it's I think unhitching from those characters is really going to be the way forward. So I really look forward to all the new content, whether it's feature films or not. What I do think though is that they'll really manage the windowing of the release of the films. It was getting to a point to where they were releasing one a year, and that I think was difficult, especially when you put in the Marvel movies in the mix. Black Panther and Solo were released, just a few weeks apart, and there was some Disney cannibalization going on. I think the way forward for Star Wars movies is just spacing them out more, right? Especially if you have the Disney Plus content and the publishing content and the game content to kind of go between the movies to help continue to feed the fan base between those big releases. I think that's going to make them more special. And because once you start kind of pumping them out so much, they start to lose their shine a little bit. Especially when it comes to the interconnected stories, it's just they become less special. So windowing, I think, will help.
YouTuber MrBeast spends $4 million a month to make 3 or 4 YouTube videos. What do you think about that?
Well, I think if the market watches it and it works for him, I think that's great. I mean, I think if he gets a return on his investment, if the ROI makes sense, Mazel tov. I think that's amazing. And I am presuming that, if you look at his numbers and the subscribers, it seems like the market is bearing out his approach. And so I think it's great. I mean, again, with any budget, right? I mean, with Game of Thrones spending $10 million for one episode of TV, for the Lord of the Rings series spending $20 million for one episode of television, or him spending $4 million for a YouTube video. If that creates a positive ROI and creates something that people enjoy and the audience responds to, I think it's awesome. I don't think it's a necessity for everybody. I think the trap is to think that means I have to spend $4 million on an episode or on a YouTube video, or if I don't spend $4 million, then I can't do a good YouTube series. Or I think people get in their head about that stuff and try to create rules and things like that. But his brand is built around these super complicated, expensive stunts and crazy things that he does. And I think, that works for him. And obviously he gets results from that. And so, I don't want to criticize that. I think it's great. And it's working, but at the same time, I think other people can do a very successful YouTube series for $0. I don't think it sets a bright line rule for everybody to follow, but for him, he's making it work for sure.
Have you studied MrBeast at all? Have you sort of done a deep dive with some of his videos?
Sure. Yeah. I wouldn't say I'm a fan. I'm not one of his fans that subscribe to his channel and watch all his stuff, but definitely aware of all the different things that he has done and how he's grown his brand and diversified his brand in a really interesting way, and the philanthropy he's done. He does a lot of really cool philanthropic initiatives. So definitely aware and appreciative of his approach for sure.
What do you think other creators can learn from his success?
I think what creators can learn from the success of MrBeast is use the platform that you have in front of you. Use the platform that is there and for free, that you don't have to wait for CBS to give you a TV deal to be able to start building your audience. And this is a refrain that I always go back to: is use the tools that you have, attack the market with what you have, and if your stuff is good enough, then you're going to start building that audience out. And so that's what I love about MrBeast is he just used what was in front of him, whether it's YouTube, whether it's Twitch, whether it's TikTok, whatever it is. Use the tools that you have. Also, you look at volume. I think, MrBeast, he produces a lot of content, and it's not just one thing every now and then. Like it's his big stunt prank things, are windowed, but there's a lot of content that comes through the variety of his channels, because he doesn't just have one channel; he has multiple channels, right? And so basically, he's his own network, if you look at it in the traditional sense. And so, volume of content in a commoditized market is a strategy that's super, super important. If you only do one thing every now and then in a commoditized market, there's so much new content that hits the market, your one thing just disappears because there's too much stuff that sort of buries it, right? So you have to be able to take a volume-based strategy to be able to compete in a commoditized market. And that's what MrBeast is doing. Lots of content on the platforms that are available to him, that the platforms that he's on. And what I like about him is diversification. Is he has different channels and different types of things. He tries different formats. It's not just a one-trick pony. He's willing to try new and different things on different platforms, in different styles and different formats and genres, and really diversify the brand. And if you look at if you read Warren Buffett or listen to Warren Buffett, which I don't know if MrBeast listened to Warren Buffett or not, but Warren Buffett says he never suggests that investors invest into companies that operate in commoditized markets, because it's just too difficult for them to compete unless they have the right strategy of competing in the commoditized market, which he says is creating a branded ecosystem based on diversification and volume and synergy. Is your stuff tied together? Are you creating lots of stuff? And are you diversifying the type of stuff that you're creating and the platforms that you're creating on? And if you look at what MrBeast is doing, he's really doing a great job of the synergy of volume and diversification. And so I think that's why he's able to compete in the commoditized market, that's the big takeaway that as a filmmaker for me, that's what I learned from him. He's not waiting on anybody to give him permission to create his stuff. And now that he's created it himself on this platform, guess what? He owns the brand. Nobody else owns his brand. And if CBS or ABC or Amazon or Netflix or whoever decides to come and say, hey, we want to do a whole, MrBeast movie or a MrBeast cartoon or a MrBeast series, he's now in a leveraged position to where he will decide how that deal will play out, because he owns his own brand. Look what happened with Joe Rogan and Spotify. He did a $500 million deal with Spotify for his podcast, because he owned his podcast, because he launched his podcast before getting involved with Spotify and grew his own audience. And that's what I love about MrBeast is MrBeast owns this brand. It's his. He doesn't have any of these studios or networks divvying up the rights or controlling them or dictating the content. Like, he's in the driver's seat of his brand, which as a creator, I am always going to root for, and I'm impressed by, and so that I'm a fan of that, and that's why I think filmmakers can learn from him as well. Is own your brand, use the tools that you have in front of you, diversify, and attack the market with volume. He's doing all those things, and it's working for him. It's playing out in the market.
What do you think about MrBeast purchasing 100 acres of land and building a $10 million studio? He's 23.
I think it's amazing. I mean, I think if you look at what Tyler Perry did, if you look at what Robert Rodriguez what he did, I mean, he's following in those footsteps as a YouTuber, which is amazing. And the more you could disintermediate other people that control your stuff and control your content, or control the way you produce the content, or how you produce the content, when you produce the content, where you produce the content, the more that you can just own your own brand in every way, that's always going to be better, right? And you know, it's an asset. I mean, it's you know, he's now a real estate magnet, right? Like it's the fact that, I mean, that's valuable, that's financially valuable, but the fact that he's creating his own studios it just shows nobody's going to tell him how to create, when to create, and why to create. So if you're using YouTube studios, there's strings attached. If you use, as well there should be, because it's YouTube studios, right? If somebody's coming into my studio or your studio, of course there's, you know, you're going to tell me how I should act, and I should tell you how you should act, and there's always going to be strings attached, and which means ultimately you don't really own your stuff. You know, I mean, it's like moving into a neighborhood with a really aggressive HOA. Right? The fact that, you know, if you can't let your lawn grow more than 6 inches high, else you start getting fines. Do you really own your lawn at that point? I mean, there's like an interesting, like, for me, I don't like that. I don't like people telling me how, like, when I need to cut my grass, or I can't, how quickly I need to remove my trash cans from the curb before I get the ticket. I don't like that, right? I feel like these are my trash cans. This is my lawn. I should be able to do with what I want, right? I feel like that's the American way. And so I love the fact that an independent creator doesn't have to go to some giant conglomerate to be able to make the stuff. And this is a refrain that I always go back to, is how does the filmmaker not wait for permission from a giant multi-billion-dollar international conglomerate to say you can create the stuff that's in your heart? How do you just go ahead and do it yourself? And by creating his own production facilities, just like Tyler Perry, just like Robert Rodriguez, just like, you know, M. Night Shyamalan, just like any of these independent creators that go and do their own thing, he's doing that, and he's gonna have his destiny in his own hands. That doesn't preclude him from working with any of these other people, but it just puts him in more of a leveraged position because he just has more ownership over everything. Literally has more ownership over the whole thing.
We think it's only a matter of time before MrBeast will make a movie and it'll gross $100 million plus.
Sure.
What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, I'm certain of it. I think he will be able to continue to grow the brand to the point to where if there's demand for a feature film or for something like that, or even a TV series, of course. I mean, you look at another YouTube breakout, The Hot Ones, which was an interview show on YouTube that was wildly popular. And it was a very basic concept where this guy, he interviews a famous person, and they eat hot wings as they interview, and the hot wings get hotter as they go. Right? Super clever concept, right? That just, you know, that slowly built a very massive audience, that 100 million people subscribe to the channel. And eventually, then he gets his own real reality show, and own real, on actual TV. He now has an interview show, and he gets called up to the major leagues because that's usually the way it goes. But he owns the brand. He established it first. So that typically is the path that brands go in. Now, does that necessarily mean that he'll have to do it? No, I think, you know, obviously, I don't think he would need to do it for any financial benefit necessarily. I don't think at this point he's super motivated by money, because he's been very financially successful, which I think is a good thing. So I think MrBeast will look at the options of, I don't have to do it for money. So the reasons I'll do it are the reasons that will help grow the brand, feed the fan base in the right organic way that makes sense for the brand. Where people, I think, where brands get off off track is when they do it for a money grab, and it's not coherent to the brand, and it doesn't feel like it's contextual in a way that adds value to the fan base. It just feels like a sellout payday. Right? And sometimes it can feel like that. But I think with MrBeast taking ownership of the brand in the way that he's done, and been able to amass the serious wealth that he's been able to amass with the brand, that the motivation won't be money, it'll be something else. And it doesn't mean it's going to be great. This doesn't mean it's going to work, but I do think he'll probably follow that path. You look at something, a board game that was created called Throw Burrito, is and Exploding Kittens, and there's a company that created these indie board games on Kickstarter, and they got to be super popular, and now they're being turned into cartoons and and TV shows and movies and things like that, because that's the way of the entertainment industry works, right? Is eventually you get that big break for the big platforms. I think MrBeast will do something non-traditional. I think maybe MrBeast, because he has a community, may not go to Paramount Pictures to make the MrBeast movie, or maybe even not even Netflix. I think maybe MrBeast does something very non-traditional, like launching a movie as an NFT on the blockchain, and pulling the community in participation of the movie through the NFT, so they could actually now participate as equity partners in the exploitation of the film, and try something different, because there's no downside for him to try that. And there's no reason he has to go to traditional Hollywood. I think, just the fact that he's been so new media with everything, and so outside the quote unquote system of Hollywood, I would guess that before he would go to a Universal Pictures or Paramount Pictures or Disney or somebody like that, or Nickelodeon, I think he would explore something non-traditional, like launching it on the blockchain, which I think would be great, because the thing that makes NFTs work is community. Having an established community that can jump in and purchase the NFT, purchase the tokens, that then monetizes the product, the movie or whatever it is, monetizes the whole project, and then gives them that profit participation and a stake in the actual brand. Where NFTs fail is a lack of community. Is they launch the NFT and there's nobody there to buy them, because they haven't built community first. The NFTs that are really working are the ones that have community first, then launch the NFT. And so the fact that MrBeast has amassed so many subscribers, amassed this huge community, I would be shocked if he didn't explore something like an NFT to be able to launch a series or launch a movie. And you're already seeing creators kind of moving into that, so it's not completely like untested waters. But I would guess that there would be some sort of willingness to do something non-traditional and outside the system as a way to create that movie or create that TV show.
Sorry guys, this entire theory doesn't hold water at all. The massive breakthrough success of the MCU has done almost nothing, in all caps, to increase the sales of Marvel Comics. As a matter of fact, the books are struggling big time. Conversely, Iron Man was a lesser-known Marvel hero when his movie dropped, and the Guardians of the Galaxy were mostly obscure comic book D-listers, both suggesting that it wasn't comic readers that made the movies succeed. It was also the quality of the Marvel movies, as movies that made people care. So yeah, go ahead and try to launch a comic and/or novel and/or video game while you simultaneously meet the Herculean task of shooting and promoting an indie movie. Good luck there. You will need it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think if you pull that apart a little bit, there's a couple interesting things that I would respond to, because I want to have empathy for that comment. And the comment's interesting. And I'll take the middle comment there first, about the Herculean task of trying to do it simultaneous of the movie. That's crazy. You should never try to be doing it simultaneous to the film. I would never advocate you trying to create a comic book while you're trying to make a movie. That's crazy. You should never do that. You should be creating the comic book well before you ever make the movie, for sure. Like you can't be anybody that's ever made a movie knows how all-encompassing it is to make a movie. You can't do anything. You can barely feed yourself and pay your bills and take your dogs on a walk while you're trying to, like, you know, at the same time of making a movie. Like, your whole life stops just so you can do that. There's no way you're going to be able to be managing, you know, the production of a mobile game and the production of an album and the production of a comic book while you're making a movie. So I would 100% agree with the commenter about that. Don't do it. Let's just avoid that altogether. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't make a comic book and a movie. Let's just make them at different times, right? So now, before you ever make the movie, let's make the comic book to then grow the audience in a way that establishes pre-awareness in the market. I mean, think about this. Think about you know, when you make a movie that's not based on, let's just say you find the financing. Let's just say, hypothetically, you find magical financing. Your grandma leaves you $100,000 in her will so that you can make your movie. So you make a $100,000 feature film, which is awesome, right? You have the financing to do it. If it's unbranded content, when you release the movie, you're releasing it to no fans. By definition, there aren't any fans because this has never been released in the market before. It's unbranded content. You haven't pushed it out at all. So there isn't anyone who loves it yet. And it could be great. I'm not saying it's not great. No one knows about it yet because the movie's not out yet, right? So you're releasing it into the market with no fans, just hoping and praying that everybody shows up on opening weekend so we can consider this a success, right? So now look at the other path. Is we know that that any movie, one, when you start production, it's going to be 2 years before that movie ever sees the light of day. But even if you go through the normal, you know, pre-production, principal photography, post-production, distribution process, but let's say even before you get to that, to the production standpoint, leading up to it, right? You go ahead and establish the market, say with a comic book or podcast. Let's just say podcast, right? So you say you launch the podcast, ideally maybe podcast and comic book, right? But let's just stick with one. Let's say podcast. If you have 10,000 people who love your podcast, that is connected narratively to the movie that you will be releasing in the future, right? So you open the brand up to 10,000 people who love the narrative universe, the story, the characters, the concept, like they're in it, right? And now they're your fans. They're in your brand. They're supportive because we love this podcast. It's awesome. We're fans of this whole thing. When you make your movie and you release your movie, guess what you're doing? You're going to release the movie and there's 10,000 fans that already love it. They already love it. They may not love the movie yet, but they love the brand. And releasing a movie to 10,000 fans who already love it is better than releasing a movie to no fans to no fans, right? Like that's the punchline. It's of course, like, think about this. If I release a podcast and I create 10,000 fans, and then I release a novel, I release that novel into a market that's warm. It's a warm market, not a cold market now. I've warmed the market with 10,000 fans. Now there's 10,000 fans that can buy my book. And then let's say I get $20 per book. Do the math, 10,000 times 20. That equals out to a profit potential. As opposed to not doing anything first and then just releasing my novel into the market to 0 fans. Does that mean that there's no way for me to make money? Of course not. There's people that make money in books all the time. But it's a harder road to release to no fans than it is to release to 10,000 fans. It's reductive thinking. You almost have to make yourself a little bit dumber to use common sense for that to make sense. I feel like we're overthinking it. Like, of course it's better to have 10,000 fans already loving your stuff when you release your movie. Of course. Right? I mean, it just makes sense. So whatever way you can establish the community of fans, any community of fans that love your brand and love your IP ahead of the release of the movie, then when you release that movie, you're going to increase your chances for success. Does it guarantee success? Of course not. But you have a higher chance of success than if you release that same movie into a cold market. That's the punchline. Now, then if you add in the fact that there's probably not, you've minimized your chance of gaining investment from a private equity investor or a studio because it's unbranded content, right? Like that's a whole other conversation that just to get the financing, you need to have that market presence by and large that comes by way of attachment or by brand awareness of the IP, right? But so there's lots of reasons you need to do this, but I completely agree you shouldn't do it at the same time. It'll make you go crazy. Right, it'll make your marriage fall apart and make you grow a crazy beard and make you stressed out. Like it's bad news. Like you should not try to juggle all the, like filmmaking is so crazy difficult. We all know being on set, it's just too difficult to do all those things at the same time, right? Spread them out, warm the market, then release the movie. So that's the middle comment. The second thing I'll address about the comment really is the first part of the comment where the commenter said that the MCU didn't boost sales of Marvel Comics, and I would agree with that as well. I would absolutely. I'm agreeing with the commenter more than I'm disagreeing with the commenter, because there's a narrative reason for that. Is when Kevin Feige launched the MCU, it was a different canon than the comics. And so, canon is sort of the official narrative that goes along with a franchise or an IP. And so what is the official story? And there was 70 years of Marvel comic narrative that had been going on forever. And when they started the MCU, they wanted to start a new canon because that was way too much complexity, way too much baggage, way too much story to deal with adequately. It just confines the filmmakers too much, right? Because there's, the only way you can make this movie is if you go read 3,000 comic books. That doesn't become an attractive entry point for a filmmaker to want to do, right? So it's just too much baggage, and so they said the MCU will be a special canon. It's going to be a new canon, that the comic books will still be the thing, will be a thing, and they'll still have their own canon, they'll have their own stories that will continue, but we're going to set up a new, completely fresh, consistent canon that starts with the MCU that won't just be the movies. They actually have a line of comic books that is a special MCU line of comic books that's tied in with the MCU, that goes along with the MCU, but those comic books aren't part of the legacy Marvel comic books that are out there. And so, yeah, of course, when the Iron Man movies and the Avengers movies and all these movies came out, they didn't boost sales of the comic books because the comic books didn't extend the story of the movies. And so from a transmedia perspective, the incentive for the audience to migrate to a different platform is that the story in the different platform is going to give them more insight and more narrative and more payoff of the thing that they love. And so if they were to learn more about these movies and the TV shows and things like that by going to the comic books, maybe they would have. But because all Marvel fans knew, that even new Marvel fans or even legacy fans, that there was a disconnected canon, there was no incentive for them to go check out the comic books. And I don't think Kevin Feige at Marvel necessarily intended for these things for the comic book sales to spike. So that's why they didn't spike. They broke the canon, and there was never a business objective or a creative objective of Kevin Feige, who's over the puppet master of the MCU. And so of course those didn't spike. Now, does that mean? See, we don't want to conflate that to say, well, that means comic books connected with movies don't work, and there's no reason because they can make it work. Like if the canon would be consistent with the film and television, and they work together, then all of a sudden they begin to feed each other. You look at the difference in how Marvel treated the legacy, the legacy comics with Marvel, and compare that to how Lucasfilm deals with the comic books in Star Wars. It's very different. And so all of a sudden, you watch the sequel trilogy and you have Kylo Ren, who is the head of the Knights of Ren. And in the movies, the Knights of Ren aren't really explained. like who they are and how he got roped in with that crew seemed just like, you know, it's a kid that kind of got involved with some bad friends that took him in a bad direction. They sort of allude to it so you can still enjoy the movie without all that backstory knowledge, right? But they revealed who the Knights of Ren are, what happened to Ben Solo after he left Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy and kind of went off on his own. They tell that complete story in comic books. And so now the comic books is now extending the film franchise, the trilogy, and now there's synergy between the two things. And so now, obviously, we have film fans who are migrating over to the comic book. Does everybody migrate? Of course not. Not everybody migrates, right? But you get the comic books do absolutely benefit from the migration of a certain percentage of the film fans that want to dig deeper and know more. Or there are some people that haven't seen the movies that are into the comic books that then find the entry point in the comic books and then find their way over to the movies because they were now interested in the Knights of Ren and that's part of the movies. And so it can flow both ways, right? So you absolutely see spikes in sales when there's intentional narrative synergy, what I call additive comprehension between the works, right? But that's an intention that needs to be made from a business perspective, a business model perspective, and also a narrative intention that goes along with that. You got to tie these stories together in a very intentional way to have that happen. If you don't intend it from a business perspective and you don't intentionally tie these stories together narratively, of course you'll never see a spike. But that doesn't lead you to a conclusion of you should never have a comic book, right? It's a complete, like, it depends on how you execute the comic book and how you execute it in the context where it goes along with the film. It's the contextual information that you kind of need to be able to make that work, right? So absolutely, the commenter is right in the analysis, but I think the conclusion that's inferred from that analysis is incorrect. You just don't want to conflate it and apply it to, well, you never need to do a comic book. Comic books are dumb. Like, you don't need to get to that conclusion. Let's just do it in the right way. If you intend it, if you intend the spike, that means you have to do it in the right way. That's all that means. They didn't. Star Wars actually did this with what they called the extended universe, which when Lucasfilm was sold to Disney, they had been writing novels and comic books and especially novels for 20 years. And there were, hundreds of novels and video games and comic books, all this stuff that Disney inherited by way of the purchase, not just the original film trilogy or the prequel trilogy. There were hundreds and hundreds of licensed works that were created, and it was too much for Lucas or for Disney to figure out. So they decanonized all that stuff and said, this isn't an official story anymore. From at this point on, we're creating new canon. We're disconnecting from this other stuff, right? So in the same way, the new stuff that they've released doesn't spike the sales of all that extended universe stuff that's older because there's a narrative disconnect, right? And it's not their business intention. So of course, whenever you have that disconnect, it's not going to achieve that result. And I don't think they're disappointed in it because they never intended to do that in the first place. And the last part of the comment is like, talked about luck. With any luck, this would happen. Of course, listen, nothing's ever guaranteed. Everything, whether it's luck or kismet or fate or destiny, whatever it is, like, of course, there's always going to be an element of right place, right time. What do you call it? Luck. Call it just whatever you call it. Karma. I don't know. There's something that this X factor that has to happen for things to pop off, to be successful. No, if anybody ever tells you that there's a guaranteed way or a guaranteed model of success in the film industry or the creative industry or creative content production, that there's a guaranteed methodology of like the silver bullet, do this every time and it's going to pop and be amazing and be huge. If anybody ever says that, you need to run the opposite direction, because it's not true. You can have the best laid plans, you can have the best stories, the best ideas, the best business model, and sometimes it just doesn't work for 1,000 different reasons. And it's not because your business model is bad, and it's not because your idea was bad, or you're like, just sometimes it doesn't work and it's weird, and it's just like, or sometimes culturally something it happens, and something pops off, and it just right place, right time, the right idea. And who knew that Baby Yoda would blow up the way Baby Yoda did? Like, like, was that luck? Was that right place, right time? What was it? I don't know. And so yeah, like, this, anything that I say is not silver bullet. I think, anybody that writes a screenwriting book of like, this is the way to structure a screenplay, that's not a guarantee. If you use the structures to guarantee that your screenplay is going to sell or be good. Of course not. Of course, you need some element of quote unquote luck in addition to best laid plans and approaches that increase your chances. Right? That's all I'm saying is if you use a multi-platform approach to attack the market in as many ways possible, to use all the tools in the toolbox, generate audience, have a market presence for your IP, be able to create an ecosystem that feeds itself in a commoditized market before you get to the big film and television investment heavy things that are so risky for people and they don't want to lose their jobs because they don't want to take the risk. If you just do that stuff, it doesn't guarantee you selling anything. It doesn't guarantee you succeeding in anything. It increases your chances. With a sports analogy, if you just take an unbranded piece of content and you just release it into the market and you try to sell the script, you try to, you just put it out there, right? It's like with the football analogy, it's like being back on your own 1 yard line, throwing a Hail Mary all the way down the field, right? That's hard. Like, it's rare that works. It's very difficult, right? And does every now and then, does it work for somebody? Of course, and that's the trap. You see somebody on a few feet down from you say, ooh, they completed their pass. That means I can complete my pass, which is true. Technically, it's true, but you may spend 20 years trying to throw that same Hail Mary down the field and it just doesn't work. And that's not your fault. And it's just doesn't mean you're a bad person or a bad creative. It just didn't work. So what I say is, let's run a few plays to move down the field a little bit. Let's do the 5-yard podcast. Let's do the 15-yard comic book. Let's do the 7-yard board game, right? And let's get to the point to where we're at the 50-yard line and throw the Hail Mary. Because everything in the film industry is going to be a Hail Mary. Everything. Even the studios, with the stuff that they do, is going to be Hail Marys. Nothing's guaranteed, right? But especially for independent filmmakers, everything that we make is going to be a Hail Mary. So, but I would rather throw the Hail Mary from the 50 than my own one. That's all I'm saying. It increases your odds, increases your chances, but you do have to have that little piece of magic. You have to have that little piece of magic or luck or whatever you call it in order for these things to work. And it's the cool thing about the industry, right? It's not ones and zeros like the Matrix. There's something else that comes in to all the stuff that you make, and it makes something come alive, and that's cool, and that's interesting, and that's what makes it exciting. So I agree with almost every single thing in that comment, which is, but maybe I have a different perspective or a different angle in it.
And sorry, for those of us who don't know football, what is the definition of that type of a pass?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry. Forget the
No, that's okay.
Football. Yeah. So a Hail Mary is just, it's usually your last resort. You're way far back on the other end of the field, and you just like throw it way up in the air and just hope that somebody catches it, right? It's not really a well-designed tactical play. It's the Hail Mary. Let's just hope and pray that something happens and it works, right? Like that's the Hail Mary, and it usually only happens when teams are getting ready to lose and they're running out of time and there's nothing else to do except throw it really far down the field, really high in the air, and just see what happens.
What can filmmakers learn from the Pixar theory?
I think what filmmakers can learn from the Pixar theory is that just how fans think. And for people that don't know the Pixar theory is the unofficial fan theory that all the Pixar movies exist in one narrative universe and they're all connected in crazy ways. Where Pixar, the official line from Pixar is that all these things are disconnected, right? And they don't have anything to do with each other. But fans, they've constructed their own crazy interconnected universe. And so what filmmakers can learn from that is that innately fans love connection. They love things to cross over. They love the one story that they love to connect with the other story that they love. They desire this. And if they don't see a connection, they will figure out how there is a connection. And if you look at fan theories, not just the Pixar theory, but just like any fan theories, there are fun and interesting, but it shows the psychology and the mentality of the modern fandom, that they crave connection. You look at something like, with the fact that if you watch episode 1 of Star Wars, in the Galactic Senate scene, there's a pod of aliens that are all ETs, which means, wait a minute, that's ET is in the Star Wars universe, and so now these things are connected in a really interesting way. Which then, if you then go watch ET, that makes that explains why ET reacts to the kid in the Yoda mask, not because he's an alien, but the reason he reacts to the Yoda mask is because he knows Yoda, because he's from the Star Wars universe, which means when E.T. makes the bicycle fly at the end of the movie, he's not using weird alien magic, he's using the Force, which means E.T.'s a Jedi, which is awesome, and fans will work all that stuff out, and which is ridiculous, but it's fun, but it's ridiculous, but what it shows, so we shouldn't discard that as filmmakers, say, oh, that's just a crazy fan theory. No, look at why the fan is doing that. And figure out what's the mentality and what's the psychology behind that. They crave connection. You think about this. Think about M. Night Shyamalan. People haven't been excited about M. Night Shyamalan in 15 years, right? But then when he made Split, right, which was a solid movie and it was good, but the best part of Split was at the end when they revealed the connection to Unbreakable. And that's when people said, oh my God, M. Night Shyamalan, he's back. M. Night Shyamalan is great. His filmmaking didn't necessarily improve. He started connecting his stories and the fans got excited about it. So then you had Unbreakable, then he connected it with Split, and then they converged those things into Glass, and he created his own little connected universe out of those 3 films, which fans loved. And it really revived his career. That one decision to connect those films revived his whole career in a great way. Right? Kevin Smith, you look back at Kevin Smith, who broke in with the glut of independent filmmakers that broke into the 90s. The thing that separated him from all those other filmmakers is the fact that he started interconnecting all his movies. His Clerks connected to Mallrats, which connected to Chasing Amy, which connected to Jay and Silent Bob, and they all existed in this little town in Jersey, and they referred to the different the plot points of the different movies in a really interesting way. But still in the way that they could still stand alone, but there was a connection. That separated him from all those other filmmakers and was able to, he created a community around his IP that other filmmakers weren't able to do because they didn't connect. And listen, I think Kevin Smith would agree that he's not necessarily the best filmmaker of all those filmmakers that broke in the 90s, right? But he was able to build just such a rabidly devout community because the fans were excited about the connections between the stories. And so for me, the Pixar theory is all about the fans and the way they think. It's not about, it's interesting to think about the witch, the witch in Brave is actually the little girl in Monsters Inc. And because when you see the witch's cabin, there's an etching of Mike Wazowski and Sully in the wood carving of the wall, which then I think the theory says after Sully leaves Boo at the end of Monsters Inc., She spends the rest of her life searching for him and uses the magic of the doors to ultimately like get trapped in ancient Scotland, but she understands how to use the magic of the doors to then turn people into bears. And the reason she turns them into bears is she's trying to recreate Sully in her own life, always without, with tragic results. And it's like, however the story goes, right? Or the fact that I think that the Pixar series theory says that, if you watch the end of Frozen, Rapunzel and the dude that Rapunzel, Flynn, the dude that Rapunzel marries, they're at Elsa's coronation, which means they're connected, which then the theory said that Elsa's parents died in a ship sinking accident, and but they actually didn't die. The ship sank. They actually made it to a deserted island, restarted their lives, had a son on the island who was Tarzan, and then the ship that sank was the ship that the Little Mermaid explores at the beginning of the Little Mermaid when she fights with the fork and all that stuff. And they create all this connection, and that's fun, right? But that's not the big takeaway. The big takeaway is, what are they doing? Like, think of that. Think about what they're doing. They're working hard to create connection. That's what they want. They love it. That excites them, right? Connection, This is why people. This is the brilliance of the MCU. This is the brilliance of what's going on with the Mandalorian. This is even in video games with things like Kingdom Hearts and when you throw a crossover character into a Mortal Kombat game, we love crossover and connection. You look at Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, Chicago PD. All the biggest ratings events in TV are those crossover events, right? As a kid, I loved it when Scooby-Doo crossed over with Batman and Robin and the Globetrotters, and there was the connection. The fans always loved that stuff, and it's always played out, which makes me wonder, why would a filmmaker ever make things without connections to other things? If you do, you're going against the psychology of the audience, because the Pixar theory, first and foremost, shows the mindset of the modern fan. Which means when you create something and you're not connecting anything, you're going against the expectation of the audience. And ultimately, that's I think if you create things understanding your audience and understand how they think and what motivates them and what they like. If you read up on this philosophy called phenomenology, phenomenology is the philosophy of the greatest artistic achievement of the artist is not the art itself. It's the experience that you create between the audience and the art. The experience is the achievement, not the art. But the only way to get the experience is to understand what the audience wants and how to create that experience with the art. And it's the combination that creates the experience. So you have to understand the psychology of the audience if you want to create that magical experience. And the Pixar theory gives us a very clear window into how the audience thinks.
So is that why people love crime podcasts or puzzles? Because we're connecting, we're trying to connect?
Of course. I think it's just that's how we operate. That's how we work, how our brains work, right? And so we're always trying to connect pieces, and our brain does it for us sometimes subconsciously, just how we are. We like these interesting connections, and it plays out in entertainment, whether it's superhero stuff, whether it's what The Walking Dead has been doing with crossing over all their shows, whether what Hanna-Barbera did way back in the day, whatever NBC does. Like, crossover events has been a staple of modern entertainment for decades. So this isn't a new thing. It's always worked, right? It's working even more now in a sort of a modern multi-platform transmedia market. But this isn't sort of a new development. It's always worked, right? So I think understanding as a filmmaker, understanding the psychology of the audience and creating content that connects with other content, it's gonna again just increase your chances for your entertainment to really succeed in today's market.